So now I get setting up a webinar for Facebook Live. Should I view this through the Zoom window or through the browser?
Go back to your Zoom window and it says we're live. So let's put this show on the road.
All right. Hey, I'm Lee Wright. I'm the founder of History Camp. Thanks for the couple-minute wait there. I'm near Boston, and with me in Virginia is...
Hi, I'm Carrie Lund. I'm the director of the Pursuit of History, and we're excited to have with us tonight author Ben Myers. He has written the book called American Citizen, The Civil War Writings of Captain George A. Brooks, 46th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. Thanks for joining us, Ben.
Hi, thanks for having me this evening.
Hey, Ben, so we're looking forward to talking with you. You and I met at History Camp Virginia last year. Before we dive into your book, though, I want to give folks just a quick update. I was out at Minuteman National Park a couple of hours ago. We were doing kind of a final run-through in advance of Saturday's America's Summer Road Trip. If you've not heard of that, check it out at americasummerroadtrip.org. We will be live from 12 historic sites across the country from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern. And I challenge anyone to go look at that list. I bet at least 2, maybe 4 of those sites will be completely new to you. It's going to be a great day, and we hope you join us. It's all at americasummerroadtrip.org. All right, Ben, so let's start with George Brooks, but we also want to talk a little bit about not just the history that you wrote about, but the history of writing the book. So who was George Brooks, and how did you decide to focus on him?
Sure. So George Brooks was actually from my hometown, Harrisburg, PA. He was a printer and bookbinder before the Civil War. And when the war started, he joined up and served in some of the most studied campaigns early in the war until his death in the Battle of Antietam. So the book is a compilation of all his writings, including his journal. He also wrote newspaper articles and his personal correspondence.
How interesting. So in addition to the hometown connection, what was it about Brooks that caused you to say, this is something I want to not only, read about, learn about, but I want to dedicate time and turn it into a book?
Yeah, so that's a little bit of a story in and of itself. So I was actually fortunate enough to know my great-grandaunt. So that's my great-grandfather's sister. And she knew her grandfather, my 3 times great-grandfather, was in the Civil War. And all I really had at that point was a name. I was about maybe 12 at the time when she was telling me these things. And I was interested in the Civil War. I wanted to learn more about what he'd experienced. And I eventually learned that his commanding officer's name is George Brooks. And Brooks's diary, his journal, still exists at the University of North Carolina, but it had never been transcribed in its entirety and published. So when I was 18, I decided I was going to go down to UNC, took a picture of every single page, and then I started to transcribe it. So that's kind of where my interest started. I was really looking for a reference to my ancestor, which, spoiler alert, did not contain. He wasn't mentioned at all, which is probably a good thing, because the only time Brooks really wrote about the enlisted soldiers was if something was wrong, like they were sick or they were killed or something like that. So I didn't find my ancestor in there, but it opened this whole world of information, a lot of which wasn't online back then, and certainly that hadn't been published in print at that point.
That's great. So in terms of constructing this, how long did it take you from, hey, I'm going to go see this journal in person, I'm going to take photographs. How long did it take you between that point and deciding that you wanted to write a book? And then between that point and having that published book in your hands?
Yeah, it's been a journey. So I said it was when I was 18 that I went down to look at the diary. So it's been 12 years. And originally, I really just wanted to read the diary. After I'd taken all the time to transcribe it and type it up, I started to find things in the text. And one of the things that I found was that he made several references to writing to what he called the telegraph. And I thought, what is he talking about here? Well, it turns out Harrisburg's newspaper at the time was called the Harrisburg Telegraph. And what he would do is he would basically take versions of his diary writings, he'd clean them up and formalize them, take the personal stuff out, he'd send them off to the newspaper and they would publish it, because that was really, their only way of getting information from the front back then. And so I went over to the Harrisburg Library, looked up the newspapers on microfilm, and found these articles he had written, which he did not sign. He signed them "Soldier" in all caps. So it was just by, seeing it in the diary that I was able to match up, okay, he's who wrote this. And so I found that, and then I eventually found, I contacted his descendants actually, and they happened to have over 80 of his personal letters. They had photographs, they even had his wife's wedding dress, things like that. And they had never really read the letters, and they ended up sending them to me in entirety. And I, again, read through them, typed them all up, figured out what they said. And so at that point, I had all this stuff he had written, and I realized that it kind of needed the context to pull it all together, so people could understand sort of what was outside the realm of his understanding at that point as a, soldier and rank and file. And so that's really when I started writing. And that was probably around 2016 that I was doing that in earnest. And then the book was published, it just came out last year, and it took about 2 years for the publisher to put it out. So, it's really been a long-term haul through most of my 20s to make this happen.
I think deserve hearty congratulations. There are so many people who said, I should write a book, or a book should be written about that, or I'd love to write a book. And precious few of those people actually follow through. And for you at a young age to have this passion and to work so hard and to realize that is just really commendable. I think it's just great. So congratulations, and thanks for all you've done to share this insight. I think sometimes it's helpful for people to try to get their hands around a huge event, sometimes by looking at an individual, right, or a piece of that. And so that's certainly what you've done with George Brooks. So for folks who are familiar with the Civil War, what are some of the things that would be new that they would get from what you transcribed, what you wrote about with George Brooks?
Yeah, well, I think it's what you just said, Lee. I mean, it's not your average history book, right? You're not reading about events that are completely abstracted. You're not getting the 1,000-foot view. You're seeing it from one person's perspective. And I think that really has a huge impact on how you can view historical events. I think that a lot of times it can be hard to learn about history because it is so abstract. It's really hard to realize, this may have happened 150 years ago, but this guy, he had all the same fears and hopes and dreams as those of us today. And one of the favorite pieces of feedback I've gotten from people who have read it are actually from people who aren't Civil War buffs. And it's their first time kind of interacting with this sort of material. And they're like, I've never read anything like this before that's so personal, and where I'm, learning about historical events firsthand as someone lived them. So I think that's really, really valuable to help people interact with history.
Absolutely. While I've not had a chance to read your book yet, there's a collection of Revolutionary War letters and diary entries and so forth, and the same story, right? Exactly your observation of understanding these people as individuals, not as the sweep of history, but decisions that are being made, right, on a daily basis, and all the strains and the agony and the joys that resulted. So did you find, in perhaps comparing Brooks and what he wrote and so forth to some of the other soldiers that have left diaries and so forth, was there anything notable about perhaps the depth of his expression, what he wrote about and so forth, versus perhaps what more of a kind of average soldier might have written about?
Yeah, I think there is actually. So he was very well educated, and his writings definitely reflect that. And that, paired with just the scope of what he left behind, you really get to know him. It's incredibly detailed and personal. I think, if you take the time to read this book, you're either going to identify with him on some level in something he experiences, or you may end up disliking him on some level for some of the things he says. But the letters span from before the Civil War in 1858 through his service in the war. So you're really finding out, part of why he joined up, part of his life before the war. That's really where he gets into some personal things. Like, you follow him through his entire rather tumultuous affair with his future wife. And you really get to know this guy in a way that I often haven't felt. Now, obviously, I've spent a lot of time with him, but I do think there's a breadth of information there that delves into his personal life a lot more heavily than a lot of accounts you might read. And he really got to me.
Sure. Did you notice a difference between perhaps what he wrote in his diary versus maybe in a letter that was mailed versus maybe something that was actually sent to the telegraph?
Yeah, absolutely. So he's there's actually a really interesting part where in the summer of 1862, the Union Army had been carrying around a ton of baggage. They were really making themselves comfortable at this point in the field. And as part of a renewed effort to actually, start winning battles, they were instructed to send all their things home. So the officers were sending home trunks full of books and, anything you can imagine that they were carrying with them. And he ends up sending home his journal, the one that's at the University of North Carolina. And although this is his military journal, supposedly, he has included many pages about the young ladies that he's meeting in various towns. Because, they didn't have any real social entertainment. That they just, went around and talked, things like that. And he writes in a letter to his wife, so you're going to get my journal in the mail. There may be a few things in it that will surprise you. I want you to know that, you should really take my interactions with women as a compliment. This is the part I said about how you may not actually like him after you read his writings. But yeah, so he's definitely, like, in his things that he doesn't think people are writing, he's a lot more candid. The newspaper articles are strictly business. And then in a lot of the letters with his wife, I mostly included them in entirety in the book, but in certain instances, I did exclude things that were purely basically nonsensical. It would be like things about friends, mutual friends, social events, things like that. They just weren't really meaningful.
Yeah. So taking this deep look at this soldier, what were some of the insights that you got about the Civil War itself?
So I was writing this and I was researching him, and because of it, researching the Civil War, like we said, from a pretty young age. And I think it really, as like, I had been a young kid interested in the Civil War, right? So I had watched the movies, I had watched Gettysburg, I had run around in the woods with a toy rifle and played soldier, that sort of thing. And so I really had this notion of, everybody went marching off the war and it was this glorious thing. The Union won the war and that sort of thing. And he really just absolutely turned that upside down for me, because the suddenness of his death at Antietam, he's actually shot in the head as they're advancing into the cornfield and he dies instantly. The fact that, when he left for the military, he actually didn't get along at all with his father-in-law, and his father-in-law refuses to shake his hand, and continues to fight with him while he's off in the service. So there isn't this glorious send-off. It isn't this adventure that even Brooks thought it would be in the beginning. And so it really challenged my assumptions about who the people were that fought in the war and what they had to give up.
How interesting. Certainly the Civil War had more attention on it due to the anniversary, and then most recently some of the controversies regarding monuments and so forth. Are there things that you came away with from your research that you reflect on as you see some of the activities going on, shall we say, today?
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of this is stuff that, my interpretation that I absolutely left out of the book, because I really wanted his words to speak for themselves. But like I said earlier, I do hope if someone takes the time to read this book, that they get to know him on some level and they realize, he wasn't so different from us. It really wasn't that long ago. For example, I don't know if you heard that earlier this year, the federal government just stopped paying the last Civil War pension to the daughter of a Civil War veteran. That's absolutely crazy. It wasn't so long ago. And it wasn't so long ago that, Americans felt that the only way to preserve our democracy was to go to war with one another. And I've really been thinking about that a lot lately with everything that's going on. And so I really think that, Brooks and his generation made a tremendous sacrifice so that future generations could continue to perfect democracy. And certainly a lot of things were left undone after the Civil War, with the failures of Reconstruction and things like that. So I think it's really important to remember that, that debt has been paid for us. And I hope that we pay that debt for future generations so they can also continue to perfect democracy.
You mentioned his death earlier, and the letters home previously to his wife, relations with his father-in-law, and so forth. Did you follow the story on at all past his death, and what may have happened with his then widow and so forth?
Yeah, there wasn't too much surviving. There's actually quite a bit about his funeral, and that's sort of where the book ends. And then I offer sort of a brief summary of what happened to his surviving family after the war. His wife never remarries, which I've always thought is quite sad. They were only married for a few years when he was killed. And he also had a young son who was born in 1860. And he actually ends up barely spending any time with his son. Brooks is out of work right before the war. His father-in-law, his fight with his father-in-law, actually causes his business to fail. And so Brooks is forced to go looking for work right before the war. He travels to Pittsburgh, he goes to Philadelphia, he's down in DC during Lincoln's first inauguration, and Brooks actually attends it, which is also in the book. And so he barely sees his son, and his son is only a few years old when his father is killed. So after the war, his son, grows up. He actually ends up moving down to North Carolina, which is where Brooks's descendants live today. But that was, that's pretty kind of where the story leaves off. His wife kept his letters, but not too much else.
So was there, after you finished going through all his correspondence and so on, what was your thought? What's next? Whether or not that's learning about something, a different aspect of the Civil War, or another project perhaps becomes a book.
I have ideas. Yeah. Yeah, I haven't committed to anything yet. I have been doing, occasionally I publish newspaper or not newspaper, magazine articles about the 46th. My research on Brooks has led to a lot of other information that didn't make it into the book, oftentimes about other officers he served with. A lot of photographs actually have turned up of the regiment. I think there's over 40 or 50 identified now, which is quite a high number. So I'm constantly kind of thinking about how I can continue to tell the story of this regiment, because back in the mid 2000s when I was just getting started, there really wasn't that much that was publicly available.
Well, so do you have an interest in writing another book?
Yes.
About the Civil War or another topic?
Both, actually. Yeah, I have several ideas, but since the last one took me 12 years, I'm kind of waiting a little bit before I get started.
So you obviously learned how to do the research, learned about Brooks, learned how to write a book, publish a book, and so forth. questions about a couple of different things.
Sure.
For people who are watching and who think, you know, I've been interested in writing a book, what's some of the advice that you would give folks?
Just start. It's really hard. Just start. If you keep thinking about it, you're not going to start. Put down your thoughts, make an outline, whatever makes sense to you, and just do what you can when you have time to do it. I stopped and started working on this book so many times because I was going to college, I was starting my career, and just didn't have the time to keep going. I mean, I almost gave up a few times actually because it was really hard to juggle with everything else. But if you can put it down sometimes and pick it up and keep it going, in the end, you've created this thing, and it's really cool to be able to share with people and be able to have conversations about it, no matter what the topic may be. You just have to keep going. It is hard. Yeah.
So let's talk about one other aspect of writing a book, and then let's go to a little more on the research. So one of the questions that comes up for folks who are thinking about writing a book is getting it published.
Mm-hmm.
Was this something that you published, or did you find a publisher for it?
I did find a publisher. So, you know, self-publishing is a really viable route right now. I could have seen myself self-publishing. I think it probably would have gotten out a little faster, actually. But I did want the support and the expertise of a publisher. And I was fortunate enough that a local publisher near where I grew up was interested in taking it, I think because of the local history connection. So I kind of lucked out there. But it is a process to research. My main advice would be to look at the books that are similar to what you want to write, whether it's a reference or if you're writing fiction, someone who publishes the type of fiction that you're writing, see who is publishing them and reach out to them. If you just kind of cold call a publisher that you think might be interested, that can be really difficult without an agent for, you know, a first-time writer. If you can get a local history tie-in for it, that can be really helpful. And also just really reference people in your network, especially historians. Ask people what's out there. I had a tremendous amount of help from a colleague at work, actually. I work in an entirely different field. But he knows a lot about the Civil War. He's active in Civil War publishing, and he had a lot of advice for me. So just, you know, see what people know. There's so much information online that can help you as you move forward at this point.
That's great. I think for people who are aspiring to this sort of thing, it's helpful to understand a little more background, and that is, you're not in history, publishing, academia, or anything like that, right? You have a career.
Yeah, no, completely different.
and yet you've taken this passion and turned it into this book. So let's go from the end of the process to earlier on.
Sure.
Were there some insights that you got in terms of researching, either about this individual or how to go about that task for someone who is taking a deep dive into following an individual and you know, finding all their papers and so forth?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I've said a few times now, there's so much online right now. It's really incredible how much history you can get to just from your computer at this point. And I say that as a young person, just in the past 15 years, it's changed a lot. One of the best resources if you're just getting started is definitely ancestry.com, which unfortunately has a fee associated with it, but it can be really useful for researching your family history to see if you had ancestors in the Civil War or whatever period you're interested in. From there, if you are interested in the Civil War, there's a great database called Historical Data Systems. It also has a nominal fee, but it's a rather large database of Civil War soldiers that's been compiled over the years. And you basically plug in a name and it'll spit out everyone in the Union and Confederate Army that is a match. And that can be really useful for determining what regiment your ancestor served in. Also, local historical societies are a major help. They exist to help you research. So I really suggest that people, send an email, make a phone call, maybe someday go out in person, because they can have a wealth of information that isn't available online already. And then most recently, there's a new resource called Civil War Photo Sleuth. That's a website. And they're basically taking photos of, again, this is Civil War specific, taking photos of Civil War soldiers and allowing artificial intelligence to do facial recognition on them. So if you add a new photo, it compares it to photos already in the database, and you can potentially make identifications that were previously unknown. So that's a pretty cool resource that people have luck with. You can add as many photos as you want after you make an account. And I think it's pretty promising for, making identifications. I know when I was getting started, I didn't have a photo of my ancestor during the Civil War. And for many years, I despaired over this, right? I really wanted to see him in a Civil War uniform after I was doing all this research. And it wasn't because of that website, it was through other research, but I actually did find a photo of him in uniform. And I would really encourage people, if you're looking for that photo of your ancestor, it very well may be out there. Keep your eyes peeled. They come up on eBay. It very well could happen that you find that picture eventually.
So, you mentioned a couple of resources there. I think everyone knows about Ancestry, but a couple of others that people may not be familiar with. Maybe you can send us a note. We'll add those to the notes about this interview.
Absolutely.
So that's very interesting. So I don't know if we have what questions we have from folks who may be have been watching. Carrie, if we had some questions come in, you want to ask Ben?
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions. So in terms of Captain Brooks's experiences as a captain, do you think that was similar to many officers during the Civil War? Did he have an unusual experience?
I think it was typical in some ways and different in others. So we do have to remember that he was an officer very early in the Civil War. He enlists right when it starts in a 3-month regiment and serves as a sergeant. He goes back home in the summer of 1861 and helps to raise Company D of the 46th Pennsylvania Infantry. So he has no prior military experience. He sets off with this newly formed company of civilians, and he's really responsible for training them in a period when there was no formalized training, right? So he's kind of learning as he goes. They were kind of fortunate that he seemed to be pretty competent at it, and he cared about them quite a bit. So he does a pretty good job of it. But all through the fall of 1861 and the spring and summer of 1862, the Union Army is really not doing well. They are not winning. President Lincoln is actually concerned that the war will be lost by the end of 1862. George Brooks is one of those captains who is out there getting his butt kicked, if I can say that. And he's trying to lead these guys, but there isn't a lot of experience at the top. His commanding officers are also mostly civilians. And so he's having this experience, this experience of inexperience that you don't get so much of later in the war. So there is a bit of a unique perspective there of hearing how he's kind of navigating through the war in that regard. Where he is, I think, somewhat different than other captains is that he functioned as a recruiter for the company throughout the war. Not only did he help to found it, but as the war was continuing, he was writing home to try to get more soldiers to join. That's actually where the title of the book comes from, his last newspaper article, Home. He writes home, and basically the boiled down version is that he encourages men to come out and, as he says, claim the glorious title of an American citizen by doing their duty. He's also traveling home to help recruit people. After the Battle of Cedar Mountain, which was in August of 1862, the 46 actually suffers 50% casualties there, so half the regiment is essentially gone. They lose a lot of men after the battle because of exposure they're not being well fed, they don't have shelter, things like that. George Brooks is wounded in a battle himself, and he goes home to recover. While he's home, after being shot in the ankles, he's trying to recruit people back to the company because they know at this point that Lee is invading Maryland, that something big is coming. He's trying to get guys to the regiment in time to stop Lee's invasion. And he actually decides to return for the Battle of Antietam because he knows that the men really don't have any officers in the regiment. And so that's why he decides to go back, and ultimately he's killed. So I think, his experience in recruiting, the level and the depth to which he cared about the organization and the regiment is somewhat unique. And especially because, so many of his writings exist, and you can really get a feel for that.
Yeah, that is definitely helpful. So can you tell us a little bit more about the living conditions of these soldiers?
Not great. One of the things that really surprised me about learning about their experiences, I think I had this illusion, and maybe others do as well, that the Union Army was better supplied than the Confederate Army. And at this stage, early in the war, they really weren't. The government was really struggling to supply all the soldiers because the Army was expanding so quickly. They were arming them with severely outdated weapons. They didn't always have good uniforms. One of the things he writes about in his journal is that in the winter of 1862, they're doing a lot of marching through the snow. And a lot of his guys don't have shoes or socks. They're marching barefoot. And so he's writing home trying to basically organize people sending socks to his men. And through the spring and summer of 1862, they participated in the Shenandoah Valley campaign, and so they were doing a lot of marching in Virginia. And if anyone who's been to Virginia knows it's humid, it's hot, it's wet. It's not a very enjoyable experience in the summer. So they were camping without tents. They didn't always have blankets. They were just sleeping on the ground. Their uniforms were falling apart. They were having trouble getting food to them fast enough. And so, especially around Cedar Mountain, which I was talking about earlier, they were actually subsisting on green corn, which made them sick. So, these are federal soldiers in the field, and they basically have none of the essentials they need to survive and fight well. And my ancestor was actually one of the men who fell sick because of this, and he spent 5 months in the hospital after that.
Wow, that is a long time. Okay. Well, thank you. That is very enlightening, because you're right. I think that a lot of people have the idea that the Union was very well supplied and in a much better condition than the Confederacy. And I suppose to a certain point they were, but that doesn't mean that everything was rosy.
Yeah, and I mean, it certainly improved later in the war, but at this point, some of them were really suffering.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ben. This has been fantastic. We have learned a lot tonight about different things. So thank you very much for joining us.
Of course.
And thank you everyone who joined us tonight. So next week, we are going to have Bob Forrant here with us, and he's going to be talking about the 1912 Bread and Roses labor strike. So that'll take us in a little bit of a different direction, and that should be an interesting chat as well. And of course, this Saturday is America's Summer Road Trip. You've been hearing about it for a few weeks. We've been working hard on it, and it is finally here. So tune in on Saturday at americasummerroadtrip.org. You'll get to see 12 different sites, and they all have been working really hard on putting together some great tours for you. It's going to be fantastic. So we hope to see all of you there.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. Again, was out today at Minuteman National Park, and we are going to be going behind the scenes. So if you've been to one of these sites before, you are going to be seeing things that were not even open to you before. So it will be a unique experience, and again, runs from 9 to 9. They will also be recorded to view later, but we hope you join us live. So at americasummerroadtrip.org. All right, Ben, thank you very much. Congratulations on your accomplishment. Carrie, I will see you Saturday.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.